Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. We're out here in my container garden again, and I thought that it would be a great time to kind of have a little chat about growing in containers. Now, I have not always liked to grow plants in containers. I kind of expanded my garden this way by default because I was out of in-ground space and I wanted more plants. So I threw a couple plants in containers, and the first few years, they didn't really do all that well compared to my in-ground garden. But over the past few years, my plants have started to really thrive up here in containers on my deck as I've learned a little bit more about how to properly take care of plants in pots. So, first of all, before we really talk about what, in my experience, have been the keys to having a successful container garden, I wanted to first talk a little bit about why you might choose to garden in containers. Whether you're gardening in containers exclusively or whether it's to supplement an in-ground garden like me. There are lots of reasons why somebody might choose to do this. Probably the first reason, and probably one of the more obvious reasons, is, a lack of space. If you have a smaller yard, if you don't have room for an in-ground garden, or if you have room for an in-ground garden, but it's not quite as big as you would like, maybe you just live in town and have a small plot of land, maybe you're renting an apartment and you don't even have access to gardening in the ground. That would be a big reason why someone might choose to garden in containers, because sometimes that's your only option, or sometimes it's just a way to expand the little space that you do have available. So that's really my reason. I don't have a super small in-ground garden, but because I wanted to have space to grow even more, I expanded to growing in containers on my deck. So that is the first reason I wanted to mention. Another reason that you might want to grow in containers is to be able to control the soil that your plants are growing in. If you are gardening in an area with really poor soil, maybe the soil's really rocky, maybe you're on somewhere with a really steep slope, for whatever reason, the soil that you have is just it doesn't really lend itself to having a thriving in-ground garden. Container gardening could be a great option. Now, it is true that there's a lot that you can do to improve the soil that you're given. But, in some cases, either that may not be something that you want to tackle. In some cases, it may not really even be possible if you're just on a rock on the edge of a cliff or whatever. Sometimes there isn't really a whole lot that you can do. Or, the other consideration is that sometimes it takes time. So you might be working on improving your soil, but in the meantime, you still want to be able to grow plants. And so you turn to container gardening in the meantime. Now, kind of along the same lines with being able to control the soil is that some plants have very specific soil requirements. And if those soil requirements are not easily met with your in-ground soil, they can be a little easier to provide in a container, like a more controlled space. For example, if you want to grow something like blueberries, those require really acidic soil. And while there are things you can do to change the pH of your soil, it can be really challenging to do in a really large area, something that you keep having to maintain. So growing something like blueberries in a really large container, or, a raised bed, which is essentially an even larger container, gives you a little more control over the type of soil that you're giving that plant. So in the case of something like blueberries, as I said, that has a really specific pH requirement. Something could also be similarly said for carrots, which prefer a little bit sandier soil. If you don't want to turn a big section of your garden into sandier soil, growing carrots in containers can be another great option. Now, another reason that someone may choose to garden in containers is to deal with some physical limitations. For example, if you have a bad back, you have knee problems, something that makes it really challenging to work an in-ground garden, containers can be a little bit easier to manage. There's the obvious factor that by putting a plant in a container, you're raising it up. So you can see some of these containers here are a little over a foot tall. That means that there's less bending, less kneeling I have to do to tend the plants in those containers. And you can get even taller containers if that works better for you. So that can be a great option if, for whatever reason, in-ground gardening doesn't work with your physical condition. So that kind of provides a nice segue into the fact that containers can just be easier to maintain in many ways in general. I'm not the best example of this because if you look at the containers on my deck, you will see that I do have lots of weeds popping up. Now, some of these plants growing in along with my tomatoes and peppers are not weeds. Some of those are companion plants that I did intentionally plant. There are plenty of other plants that were just planted by nature that will take over if I don't pull them out. So I am going to have to pull them out. So it's not that weeding is non-existent. in a container garden, but it is more manageable. You know, I don't have to deal with any kind of pathways. Weeds are not going to take root on my deck or your patio or whatever area you have your container set on. You're going to have to deal with the container itself. But that's, in the word container, that's a contained amount of space. So it can be a lot more manageable. And also, weeds can be much easier to pull out of container soil than in-ground soil that can get compacted and the weeds can go a lot deeper in the in-ground garden and can be a lot more challenging to pull out. So similarly, you're likely to deal with less pest pressure in your container garden. There will still be lots of flying insects that can have access to your containers, but you're probably, at least in my experience, I have had to deal with fewer, ground creatures, like for example, voles that tunnel under the ground. Those are one of the banes of my existence when it comes to gardening. So I don't have to deal with those at all in the container garden on my deck. Also things like slugs. Well, I get the occasional adventuring slug that makes its way up my deck. It's pretty rare, definitely much less than I have to deal with in the garden. So pest pressure can definitely be minimized in a container garden as well, which, makes a little bit lower maintenance. So another factor that you might consider that might lead you to choose container gardening is ease of access. So these plants right here, now obviously this is going to vary depending on where you would situate an in-ground garden. But all these plants right here are growing on my back deck right outside my door. If I'm cooking in the kitchen and I need something from the deck, I can just step out here real quick. I don't even have to throw my shoes on. I can just grab whatever I want and head right back in. Really quick, really easy. So something like that definitely leads to easier harvest. It also can lead to, more maintained plants. If they're in a well-traveled area where you regularly go, you're going to notice problems with your plants. You're going to notice things that need your attention. So that can make it, so ease of access is definitely something that should not be underestimated. Another benefit of container gardening is the fact that they are, to some extent, it's going to depend on the size of containers that you use, but to some extent they are portable or movable. You're able to change your garden plan. You can kind of mix things up a little bit. This can be especially useful if, say, you're renting and you're going to be moving in a year or two, and you don't want to spend all that time establishing a garden that you're then going to have to leave behind. This way you can take your containers with you, and you can even take your plants with you. Additionally, if you set it up in an area and you find that, this area doesn't get as much sun as I want, or there's some sort of obstruction for sun or rain or just whatever growing condition isn't great in that area, it's a lot easier to move a container garden than it is to move an in-ground garden. And then there's just the simple fact that some plants just do better in containers. So I know many people out there, probably many of you, have had amazing success growing peppers in the ground. That has not been my experience. I have grown peppers in the ground many times over the years, and every single time that I try it, the peppers that I have growing in containers completely outperform the containers in the ground, which is interesting because many plants that I grow, I find do a lot better in the ground. Peppers just really, in my experience, really like to be in containers. So while many of you may have success growing peppers in the ground, I have not. I have had great success growing them in containers, so I'm going to continue to do that. So that's another thing to consider is what you're growing and how it will respond to being in a container. One other little perk of container gardening that I like is that I can bring my potted plants inside over the winter. Now, we did a container garden tour a few days ago, and I mentioned this rosemary here. Now, in many areas, rosemary is a perennial and will come back year after year when planted in the ground. It is too cold. The winters in my area are too cold, and rosemary will not overwinter. So I like to plant my rosemary in containers for that reason, and then I can bring it in over the winter. And of course, I did mention in that video that my rosemary tends to not make it through the winter, but it does give me a few more months of rosemary harvest as opposed to if I left it out on my deck and it died when the weather got really cold. This way I at least get rosemary through the end of the year, and then I have to start over again in the spring. So I have personally not had great success with this, but I know many people overwinter pepper plants inside as well. If you have a potted pepper plant, you can bring it inside and keep it alive over the winter, which incidentally, a little bit of an aside here, if you have successfully done that, I would love to hear what tips you have, because I have tried it twice now, and both times my pepper plants have not survived. So I would love to hear any tips on that. That's an aside. So back on track now. So bringing plants inside over the winter is a great perk of container gardening. And kind of, the opposite end of the spectrum, I find that container gardening can also give you a little bit of a jump start on the gardening season. Now, I mentioned this when we did a container garden tour a few days ago. I mentioned that I planted some of my container plants a little bit earlier than I planted the plants in the ground. And that is because there's two factors at play there. First is that I knew that if we had a late frost, if we had an unexpected really cold night, I could bring the plants inside and just get them through that cold night and bring them back out and they would be fine. So that gave me a little bit of flexibility. I would not have been able to do that with a giant tomato plant that I had planted in the ground. I'm not going to dig it up, put it in a pot and bring it in. But the tomatoes that were already in pots on my deck, I could easily bring those into my house. Now, additionally, there is the fact that soil in containers tends to warm up more quickly than soil in the ground. So this little pot here, when it's all exposed to warm weather, surrounded by warm weather, and it doesn't have the cooling influence of all the cold soil around it that the in-ground garden does, it warms up pretty quickly. So because of that, soil temperatures are less of a consideration when it comes to early planting in the garden. So that is the list of reasons that I came up with why someone may choose container gardening, either as their sole source of gardening or, as a supplement to an in-ground garden. If you have any other reasons, go ahead and leave those in the comments because I'm sure I did not think of everything. So now that we've talked about why you might choose container gardening, let's talk a little bit about how to do it successfully. As I mentioned, there are many years that I tried it where, I had enough success that I continued to do it, that it still seemed worth doing, but not enough that I felt like my plants were really thriving until the last few years. The last few years, I've had a lot more success container gardening, and I think that's because I finally figured out some of the little tricks, which will probably seem obvious to a lot of you guys, but we're going to go through it anyway. So the first thing you want to consider when container gardening is potting soil. So, plants for the most part have pretty simple needs. They need nutrients, which comes in the form of soil. They need sunlight and they need water. So those are the same requirements. Your plants in the ground have the same requirements as your potted plants, but the thing is that you're going to meet those needs a little bit differently. So the first thing you're going to want to consider is the growing medium or the potting soil that your plants are going to be growing in. And I say potting soil or potting mix because you are going to want to use that. You do not want to use soil from your ground in a container, and you don't want to use bagged garden soil for a container. Obviously, it's going to vary a little bit depending on your specific growing conditions on the specific soil in your area. But for the most part, soil from the ground tends to compact and be a lot more dense and heavy than a good quality potting soil or potting mix will be. Plants in containers have a limited space. They have limited resources. They can't just extend their roots out as far as they want. They have only access. They only have access to what you're going to give them in that pot, and so you need to make sure to give them what they need in that small area. So potting soil or potting mix is going to lead to your plants really being able to sink their roots into that soil and just to be able to get them off to the great start that they need. Additionally, potting soil or potting mix for the most part is going to have some sort of nutrients in it, whether that's in the form of fertilizers added to the soil or that's in the form of compost or worm castings. It's going to vary a lot depending on what type of potting mix you use, but potting mix will have some sort of nutrients for your plants. Kind of jumping off of that, the next thing you're going to need to consider is the container. Now, first of all, you want to make sure that you have a well-draining container. If you have a container with a solid bottom and no drainage holes, what is going to happen is when you get heavy rains or when you water your plant, that water is going to have nowhere to go. It's just going to sit in the soil and get waterlogged, and your plant could eventually suffer from root rot or the inability to take up nutrients. Obviously, we want to make sure that our plants get enough water, but soil in the ground will naturally kind of drain out. I mean, some soil drains better than others, but it will naturally kind of drain out and spread into the surrounding soil. When you have containers, again, you're giving your plant the only option it has is that little container that you've provided for it. So you want to make sure that that container has the ability to release excess water rather than having it kind of sit there in a puddle and your plant's roots just being exposed to it. Because plant roots do need water. They also need access to the air. So if the soil's completely waterlogged, your plants won't have access to air and your plant will end up drowning. We obviously want to avoid that. So make sure that your container has good drainage holes. Another thing you want to consider is the size of the container. Now you can see on my deck here that I have plants growing in all different sizes of containers. I will admit that I kind of push the limits a little bit here. I tend to kind of push the boundaries with a lot of gardening choices that I make, and sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't. But you're going to want to consider, for example, if you're growing something like a tomato plant can get very large unless you're growing a specific type of tomato, a dwarf tomato, or something that is specifically bred to stay really small. Tomato plants in general tend to get very large, and they have very large root systems. So you want to choose a large container when it comes to something like a tomato plant. If you put a tomato plant in a little tiny container, the plant's going to stay really small. It's going to be stunted and it's going to affect your harvest. The plant's not going to be healthy. So giving a tomato plant a really large container is definitely what you want to do. Now, most plants, in my experience, I have a limited variety of plants that I grow in my container garden. I find that most plants will prefer a larger pot as opposed to a smaller pot. There are some plants that are a lot more prone to root rot, and if the plant is small, you don't want to put it in a really large container because then it basically leaves more area for water. It basically leaves more area for water to be trapped and can lead to root rot. I know citrus plants tend to be like that, so you don't want to put them in a pot that's too large for the size plant they are. The plants that I'm growing here, are perfectly fine with larger containers. Now, how large the container is, how much soil that container is able to hold, is going to have an effect on how much watering you have to do. Because that soil in that container will hold on to water, but it can only hold on to so much water. And the larger the container, for the most part, the more water it can hold on to, which means the less frequently you're going to have to be watering. If you put a plant into a really small container, that can be more of a commitment, just knowing that you're going to have to water every other day, possibly even more than once a day, depending on your weather conditions and depending on the type of plant that you're growing. And that kind of brings us to the next key with growing plants in containers, and that is the fact that you have to be really conscious of your watering schedule. You are going to have to make a point to water regularly. Now, I will say, when it comes to the in-ground garden, I am a little bit of a lazy gardener. I'm not one of those that waters my garden every day. I tend to water my garden infrequently, and when I do water it, I water it deeply, which that's a separate topic. That does lead to healthier root growth in in-ground gardens for the most part. Containers are different though, because containers, as I said, plants in the ground can just keep sending their roots deeper and deeper in search of water. Plants in containers are limited by the size of the container, and if that container has no water in it, your plant has no water to find. So it can be really important, especially in the heat of summer and especially if it's been really dry. Often you will have to water your container garden every day. Now, here in Connecticut, there isn't a large chunk of the summer where I have to water my containers every day, but there usually is a stretch where it gets really hot for a week or so in the middle of summer. We haven't had any rain, and I do sometimes have to water my containers every day. So you just want to monitor your container garden and make sure that you water it regularly. You're also going to want to make sure that you fertilize your plants regularly, feed them regularly in some way. As I mentioned, if you get a good quality potting soil or potting mix, it will come with nutrients already in it, and that will feed your plants for the first, few weeks or so. You can check your potting soil bag and see what it says as far as how long it feeds your plants. That's still going to be a rough guideline. It's going to depend on what type of plant you're growing in there, how much rain or water the plant gets. There's many factors, but it will give you a guideline. Once that time has gone by, you're going to have to make sure to continue feeding those plants because, as I said, it's the same principle that it is with the water. They only have access to that limited space. One type of fertilizer that I like to use specifically in containers are these organic vegetable fertilizer spikes. Now, I've used this brand many times. I'm sure there's lots of other brands out there, so I don't have any kind of affiliation or anything. I just happen to have this on hand. I like these because these are solid spikes. I'll open this up and show you. These are solid spikes that go into the soil, and they're slow release, which means that it basically means less work for me. I don't have to come out and feed the plants as regularly. So there's just these little solid spikes of fertilizer here. So I just follow the instructions on the plant package and stick them in around my container plants. Now, as I said, I don't do that right at the beginning. I have not done that yet this year because my plants are still using the fertilizer that was included in the potting soil that I planted them in. Now, I do, kind of as a side note, I don't completely I don't completely replace my potting soil every year. At the beginning of this gardening season, I did do a container, reset of the garden where we refreshed the soil in a lot of these containers. I can link that video below. Basically, I topped all of my pots off with some slow release organic granular fertilizer and a couple inches of compost. So I find that doing that is a great way to save a little money and not have to completely replace the potting soil every year. But once that nutrient bank is depleted, I do like to do something like this. You could also use a fish emulsion fertilizer. That's a more fast-acting fertilizer. So that's something that you would have to do more regularly, but it can give your plants a really quick boost if they need it. So that's another great option also. One final consideration that I wanted to mention when it comes to successful container gardening is choosing the right varieties. So choosing varieties of plants that tend to be a little bit smaller at maturity as opposed to really large can lead to a more successful container gardening experience. So for example, if you wanted to grow bush beans as opposed to pole beans, which is not to say that pole beans can't be grown in containers, they absolutely can be. It's just it's going to require a little more hands-on maintenance. So for example, determinate tomatoes I find are a great option for containers. I think I have maybe 2 determinate tomatoes on my deck, and the rest of these are indeterminates. So as I said, this isn't a hard and fast rule. This is just a little bit of a guideline. I find that cherry tomatoes tend to do pretty well in containers because smaller fruits and the plants don't have to use as much energy to produce each fruit. So I find that I still get a good result with cherry tomatoes on the deck. So this is something to kind of play around with, but just know that if you find varieties that are specifically bred for containers, varieties that are mentioned as dwarf, varieties that are called, say, patio tomatoes, often it will mention that they're specifically bred to be grown in pots. You'll have a higher chance of success with varieties like that. As I said, that doesn't mean you can't grow other varieties, but just something, especially if you're first getting started, you may want to try at least a couple of those varieties just to see how they compare with others. So again, I am sure that there are some great container gardening tips out there that I have missed. So if you have a great container gardening tip, something that's worked really well for you, go ahead and leave that in the comments because I would love to hear it. And I'm sure many other people watching this video would love to hear container gardening wisdom from other people besides me as well. So thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really looking forward to this container garden growing as the season goes on. I can't wait to start harvesting from it and just to share the progress with you. So definitely check back, and I will be giving regular updates throughout the season as the container garden grows. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I hope you're having a great day, and I can't wait to see you soon. I'll see you next time.